Stay stitching stops you from accidentally stretching out your neck or armhole or whatever you're sewing while working on it or trying it on. And understitching stops your lining or facing from poking out. I'm Ali and I've been making clothes since the early 90s, so I have made a lot of dresses and other garments that have exactly these kind of necklines, and I can't say enough that these steps are so important. You might see them on sewing patterns or watch them in tutorials and think, oh, I'll just skip that bit, I'm not too fussed about doing that, it's going to be quicker not to do it. But actually it saves time in the long run. It gives you a much better final finish, but also by doing those steps, it makes the next step on a little bit easier, and it just prevents you from making mistakes. So if you want a professional finish, make sure you don't skip those steps. So with the help of my little sample that I've made, and there's another one behind me, I'm going to show you everything you need to know to be able to do this perfectly. Obviously this is only a little sample, but it's exactly the same as what you would do when you're making a whole garment. So I'll show you the stay stitching first. I'll show you how to sew it, what stitch size you need, basically everything you need to know, the positioning, all of that stuff. I'll show you how to do that, and then I will show you how it compares to something that hasn't been stay stitched. And then once I've done that, I'll move on to the next step, which is showing you how to get the lining in and then do the understitching and why that is important. Now, it's always hard to show on a video when something is like a detail that you see close up. It's always hard to show it on a video. So if you look at my neckline here, you can see I've got the facing on the inside. It doesn't poke out at all, but these things are hard to show up. So I've tried my hardest to get it close enough to the camera for you to see without it going blurry. But when you see these things in real life, you see that it does make that difference. So for example, looking at my neckline, if I had a lining in it, and when you have a bold pattern like this, it's hard to know what colour to pick. When you're standing much closer to me, you don't want to see a little hint of a plain colour. You want that all on the inside. Even if I put a completely different colour lining in this, if it's done properly, you won't see it. So where the stay stitching is the most important is when anything's on the bias. So the straight of grain, normally when you do things, unless it's bias cut, go down and they go across. And of course, when you have a neckline, if it's a neck like this, then these parts here go on the bias. If you've got a V-neck, the whole thing could be on the bias, or kind of almost on the bias. And that's where it could really stretch. So with V-necks, this is even more important than with a round neck like this. And then you've also got bits like on armholes here, it could be on collars, because it's not just where it's cut out like this, it could be a rounded shape as well that goes on a collar around, it could be on a hem, it could be in all sorts of places, but basically anywhere where it's cut on the diagonal, on the cross, or on the bias, whichever term you want to use, that's where it could stretch, and this just prevents it from stretching. So let's have a look now at how to do the stay stitching. So when you're stay stitching, it's basically for any bits that are rounded like this or a V, anything like that, and it doesn't have to be on a neckline or an armhole, it could be on a collar, it could be on any part of the garment, but it's basically where you're going across. So obviously on a woven fabric, if I pull this way, it doesn't stretch, and if I pull this way, it doesn't stretch. But if I pull this way, it does. So when it's on a cut edge, it could really easily stretch as you're working on it or when you're trying it on for fit. So doing stay stitching around here is going to really help maintain that neck shape. So what I'm going to do is, if I just draw on here, let's just zoom in so you can see a bit better. 1.5 centimetres is where my seam allowance is. But what I want to do is I want to do my stay stitching just a little bit in from there. So about that distance, because when I come to sew my lining or facing on, I don't want to be sewing through the stitch line that I've already done. I really want to get it as close to the stitch line as possible without actually being on the stitch line. So I'm going to sew this now, and I'll show you how I do it and the stitch length and everything, just to do the stay stitching around here. So I'm just sewing this with a regular straight stitch, and I've got a stitch length of 2.6, and this is my 1.5 centimetre line here. So I'm just leaving a little gap so that my stitch line, hopefully it will line up with this when I get around to it, is going to be just inside where I'm going to be sewing the lining on in a minute. So just take it slowly, and I'm looking at this line here rather than my dotted line, because in reality I wouldn't have that drawn on there. And yeah, it lines up pretty well with that. So I'm just going all the way around, and what I'm doing is I'm making sure I'm holding it the way I am like this, because I don't want it to stretch, and I'm sewing nice and slowly, because if I sew quickly, there's a lot more risk of this accidentally stretching, and that's the last thing I want to happen. So going along this bit is not so bad, because obviously that is on the straight of grain. But as I come round here again, I need to just really take my time, just making sure nothing stretches. So I will finish off sewing this round to the shoulder, and then we can have a little look and compare it to one that I haven't stay stitched. And so here it is. So you can see when it's laying flat there, I've not accidentally stretched it out as I've been sewing it. So you can see if I pull it there, it doesn't stretch now. It's not going to stretch there or in the middle anyway, but it's this bit across here that could potentially stretch. And by doing that, it doesn't. So this bit is exactly the same shape. And if I pull that bit there, you can see the stretch. It doesn't stretch massively because this is quite a stiff fabric, but you can see if I do that, it does stretch a little bit. And already you can now see that it is a little bit looser there. And if I do that again, you can see it's really not letting me stretch it. So by doing that, you just prevent, like if I pull it like that, you can really see it going out of shape. It's still not too bad on the part where you're going to be doing the seam, but doing this step for the few minutes that it takes, because it really doesn't take long at all, it just prevents any of that stretch happening. And I would always do all my stay stitching at the beginning. As soon as I've cut out all of my bits of fabric, I would stay stitch the neck, I would stay stitch the armhole. You don't necessarily need to stay stitch all the way up here because that is on the straight of grain, but certainly around here will help. And also any other things that you are worried that could stretch, so particularly for collars, any kind of openings, pocket openings, things like that, it's just worth doing. So as soon as you've cut everything out, just have a good look at anything that might have a bit of a curve that could do with some stay stitching. Okay, so that is the stay stitching, and the other step I'm going to show you is the understitching, which I think is almost more important than the stay stitching, because the finished garment, you want that lining staying on the inside and it helps, but also it helps when you're ironing your garment. You should always press as you go, and when you're pressing something like a neckline like this, if it's trimmed and understitched, actually pressing it is really easy. It just falls into place naturally. Whereas if you haven't got the understitching, you have to kind of tease out the neckline, or you have to pin it first. So although you might be spending a little bit longer doing the sewing, the pressing is quicker, so it doesn't actually take any more time to do this part of the process. So now that I've got that done, I'm going to add a lining so that I can show you the understitching as well. And the combination of the stay stitching and the understitching is what makes for a really perfectly finished neckline. You want your lining or your facing to stay on the inside. You don't want any of this poking through, and you want it to fit nice and snug to your skin. You don't want it gaping or looking baggy or stretched. And this combination of these two stitches, both of which are really quick, just helps you get that really, really nice crisp look. So this is my neck here. I've put the lining on and I'm gonna stitch this now. So this would be for a bagged out neckline. So any kind of necklines or armholes that are bagged out, it's the same principle. So let's go and get this sewn on now. So again, I'm just using exactly the same stitch, just a 2.6 stitch, and I'm now lining it up with the 1.5 centimetre mark here. So it's stitching, I'll show you in a second, you'll see it through the lining, but it's stitching right next to that stay stitch. So I'm literally going to just sew around here, and because I've got my stay stitching in there already, it means I don't have to worry so much about accidentally stretching this as I go around this curve. If I hadn't have done the stay stitching before I started this part, then there would be a risk of me stretching it. But now the stay stitching is there, it's very, very unlikely that I'm going to accidentally stretch this as I sew it. In fact, it's probably going to be quite difficult to stretch it if I want to. So this is why doing these steps just makes your finish much better. So I'll finish sewing this on and then we can have a look at the two stitch lines together. And you can see here now, there's my little bit of drawing underneath. You can see that the stay stitching that I did first is literally just inside the seam allowance from my actual seam. You could get it slightly closer if you want to, but that is near enough. It stopped me stretching it when I sewed it, and that's the whole purpose. So that's my lining now on, and to do my understitching, I need to stitch through my lining. I've used a nice see-through lining so you can see exactly what's going on. And I'm going to stitch just inside here. So you could trim some of this or snip it if you want to first, but I tend to do all the sewing and then I trim after. So let's have a look now how to do that understitching. So you can see here I've got my seam allowance. It's all sitting on this side, and I want the seam allowance from both bits of fabric, both to sit underneath my lining. And you don't want to pull this really tight, but you want to make sure that it is pulled nice and flat there. And you just want to stitch it right next to it. So I'd say this is about 2 millimeters from where I've stitched it on. And I'm just staying with the regular stitch, or you could go slightly bigger on your stitch for this, but just a regular straight stitch is all you need, and just stay slightly in from that seam and just take your time, again, sew nice and slowly, because you don't want this to go off, and you certainly don't want to accidentally sew on the outside fabric, and just sew all the way around. And that's my understitching all now finished. I've made sure I've used a contrast colour so you can see it. So you can see how close it is to where I sewed it on. So now the lining, or if you're using a facing, it's exactly the same, needs to go on the inside. Now without any trimming or snipping, clearly that's not going to sit on the inside without my lining showing or looking an absolute mess. So what I need to do is I either need to snip it or I need to trim it. I'm going to do one side of snipping and one side of trimming so we can see the difference. So on this side, I'm just going to put plenty of snips in here to help it go around that curve. And on this side, I'm just going to trim it nice and short. So you don't want to go too short that it could fray after a few wears and washing it, but you want it to go fairly short so that it's going to curve properly around there when you turn it in. So let's now put this to the inside, and you can see already without pressing that is clearly so much better. So I'm going to go and give this a good press so we can see how it looks. And here it is finished off. So this side has had the snips and this side is the side that's trimmed. If I show it that way you can see it a lot better. So you can see it is a nice shape, it's laying flat to the table, and that's the stay stitching that stopped that stretching. And then the understitching has stopped my lining poking out. If I go like this, if I need to hold these sides because realistically on a garment it's obviously going to be attached on both sides, but if I do that, I've purposely used a different colour lining, you can't see that lining poking through. And just to compare it, I made one that I didn't do understitching on. And if I go like this, I don't think you can probably see it on the video, but you can see a slight hint. If I hold it up there, maybe you can see it. You can see a slight hint. It is only a little bit, but it's that hint that you don't want to see. If I turn it over, you can just see that this stitching is helping this stay lovely and flat, whereas on this side, my lining is able to bunch up a little bit more. I think it's a lot more visible in real life than it is on the video. But anyhow, it is a step that I think is absolutely essential, and one that takes such a small amount of time just to make sure that stays on the inside. And obviously the bulkier the fabrics you've got and the more difference there is between the outer fabric and the lining, the harder it is for that lining to stay on the inside when you don't do this step. So to get this perfect neckline, you do your stay stitching first, then you do your understitching after you've stitched it on, and all the trimming and pressing that you need, and you will have a perfect neckline. Okay, so that's it. That is all of the stay stitching and the understitching. And the other thing I will say is when you're doing an armhole and a neckline like this, you can't always get the understitching on the armholes and the neck because it's just too fiddly to get on the inside. It's quite common to have a bit of understitching towards the bottom of an armhole and then have it on the whole neck, but I would always recommend putting the neck in first, making sure that's understitched, because that's the main bit that you see, that's the most important bit. And then if you want understitching on your armholes too, quite often I don't do that. I don't put the understitching on here, and then I just make sure they're fixed on the side seams so it doesn't poke out. By having it the right size, it automatically helps it stay in anyway. But if you do want to do understitching on your armholes, just go as high up to the shoulder as you can get to before it gets too fiddly. So I wanted to keep this tutorial nice and short because it's only a little step. I don't want to talk any longer than I need to. So I hope I have covered everything that you need to know to do this. If I have missed anything or anything isn't clear, then do please ask in the comments, because I always get back to everybody who asks me any questions at all. And if you want to see any other tutorials that are on this kind of subject, then do please ask, because I'm always wanting to know what people are wanting to see. If you've liked this tutorial, make sure you check out my other tutorials. I have plenty of quick ones like this with little tips and much longer ones too, showing you how to make complete garments.